Amen. Well, it is good to be back with you guys. It was wonderful taking Holly down to Mexico for an anniversary trip, and then we went to Canada, like the warmest of the warm to the frigidest of the frigid. And though Canada was really cold, the warm welcome we received from the church there in Quebec around Montreal was warm and great. And they sent us a funny message after we left. It was like 30 to 35 degrees like the whole time I think we were there. No, it was really cold. And it was not warmer than this. And they were like, hey, well, the Florida weather's left with you guys. It's now minus 20 and we're getting 5 feet of snow today. Like the day after we left, we're just like, oh, I would have died. But it's good to be back home and back with you guys. And today, we now re-enter into Genesis. We come to a text in Genesis chapter 43 that is as instructive as it is understandable. For all the major players before us in the chapter today will experience great trouble in the present because of their past. Great trouble in the present because of their past. Yet in the end, they all find relief and renewed joy. So here's my question as we begin today to you. Does this story sound like your story? Trouble in the past that is giving you great trouble in the present. I want to say that's everyone, but I want you really to think about you. Does pain in the past cause trouble in the present? Whether it was a single moment or a season of life, however painful it might be to remember it, I want you to know today that though that might legitimately always be painful for you, it does not have to be paralyzing to you. That's the great hope and the reminder in the chapter before us. It's what all the major figures here experienced. Well, Jacob in part. He'll get the news of what's going on later. Without further ado, let's look into the text to see this. It's Genesis 43. It covers the second journey that the brothers of Joseph take to Egypt to get more food. We saw the first journey last week in chapter 42 as Brad led us through that. And this chapter, though, easily divides right in half. So there's only two headings today. First, in verse 1 to 14, we'll see all our characters famished in Canaan. Then the back half of the chapter, verse 15 to 34, we will see them feasting in Egypt. That's the two headings. So let's see the first, famished in Canaan. Follow along as I read verse 1 to 14. Now the famine was severe in the land, and when they had eaten the grain that they had brought from Egypt, their father said to them, "Go again, buy us a little food." But Judah said to him, "The man solemnly warned us, saying, 'You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you. If you will send our brother with us, we will go down and buy you food. But if you will not send him, we will not go down. For the man said to us, You shall not see my face unless your brother is with you.' Israel said," that's Jacob, "Why did you treat me so badly as to tell the man that you had another brother?" They replied, "The man questioned us carefully about ourselves and our kindred, saying, 'Is your father still alive? Do you have another brother?' What we told him was an answer to these questions. Could we in any way know that he would say, 'Bring your brother down'?" And Judah said to Israel his father, "Send the boy with me, and we will arise and go, that we may live and not die, both we and you, and also our little ones. I will be a pledge of his safety. From my hand you shall require him. If I do not bring him back to you and set him before you, then let me bear the blame forever. If we had not delayed, we would now have returned twice." Then their father Israel said to them, "If it must be so, then do this. Take some of the choice fruits of the land in your bags and carry a present down to the man: a little balm, a little honey, gum, myrrh, pistachio nuts, and almonds. Take double the money with you. Carry back with you the money that was returned in the mouth of your sacks. Perhaps it was an oversight. Take also your brother and arise, go again to the man. May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man, and may he send back your other brother and Benjamin. And as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved." Well, as chapter 43 begins, we're reminded that a severe famine continues to ravage all the land. We saw this famine begin at the end of chapter 41, and then we saw Jacob send out his sons, the brothers of Joseph, to their first journey to Egypt in chapter 42. They returned home from that journey with food, but without Simeon, because Joseph, that they didn't know was Joseph, we know it's Joseph as readers, kept a brother back. Now, Joseph's up to all kinds of things. We'll talk about that, but we're unsure of exactly how much time went by between the end of chapter 42, while Simeon's up there seemingly in jail in Egypt, and the beginning of chapter 43, when they run out of the food that they brought back home to eat. I think a long estimate is 2 years. A short estimate is just a few months. It was probably sometime in between that, really depending on how much food they bought and how much they could carry back home. But the chapter begins with all that food running out. And so Jacob, he must have known this was going to be explosive to his sons, goes and tells the sons, as if it were a small thing, like they could just go to the Aldi in downtown Cairo. "Hey, we're out of food. Go buy us a little and bring it back." And they're like, "The guy said he's not going to even meet us unless we have Benjamin." And so this whole big thing explodes with them, bringing them right back into the debate that they had in the previous chapter. As these words came off of Jacob's tongue, I'm sure the brothers at first were just looking around at one another like, okay, who's going to tell Dad that we have to bring Benjamin? Judah, the fourth son, is the one who ultimately speaks up, reminding his father in verse 3 to 5, they cannot go back to Egypt unless Benjamin is with them. Now, before you see Jacob's response with complaint and whining, I think is the right word, in verse 6, notice that it says Israel responded. It doesn't say Jacob, it says Israel responded. Well, this is for a few reasons. I think it's firstly to remind us that Jacob has become a new man way back in chapter 32 at the moment when he wrestled with God and his name was changed, a new name and a new walk. Right? He limps now for the rest of his life because of the wrestling match with God when God overpowered the man who so tried to overpower others in life. But it also tells us Israel, the name is used to remind us that he's still the head of the family. The brothers themselves are hungry, as is Jacob, but they could have just as easily stolen Benjamin and gone to Egypt to get food without Dad's permission. But the name Israel is used to remind us as readers, he's the head of the home, the head of his tribe, the head of this family. And so they do not go, even though Dad is a bit out of sorts and in a fragile state of emotions. That we see in verse 6 as he responds, "Why did you treat me so badly as to tell the man you had another brother?" This surely had been bottled up for some time, as he thinks just they're going to go get a little food, then this explodes back out. The rest of the brothers, it says in verse 7 and 8, all of them kind of chime in real quickly. This causes a big skerfuffle. In verse 7 and 8, they were just answering the man's questions. How could we know that he was going to do this? And ask for the brother to come back. Well, as the tension is once again rising high, their conversation growing heated like last time, Judah in verse 8 to 10 steps in, as he did before, with careful and clear words to Dad. In verse 8, Judah asks that Benjamin go to Egypt with him. In verse 9, Judah sacrificially pledges himself to bear all the blame if Benjamin is not returned with them from this trip. And in verse 10, I think probably gently but firmly and obviously, he points out the bleak nature of the situation. If we would have had this chat already, Dad, we could have made this journey and come home twice by now. Jacob is confronted in these words. Not only confronted by the hunger in his belly, but confronted with the words of his fourth son. And he needed to be confronted because he greatly fears losing his dead wife, Rachel, their second son, Benjamin. They already lost the first. Joseph is gone. He now greatly fears losing the other son, and he seems to be unwilling to acknowledge the truth about their present condition. And we know, for better or worse, Benjamin has to leave if they're all going to live. Or to put it another way, more from Jacob's perspective, to save Benjamin and all the others, Jacob must let Benjamin go. We might wonder at this point, verse 10, as the end of it happens, how much time goes by when Judah stopped talking and Jacob gave them permission? It could have been immediate. I don't think it was. That's not how we really talk to one another in very difficult times. This requires some time, some process, some reflection. But we are sure, even though we're not sure of the time, we're sure of Jacob's response. And we're sure that it was a heart-wrenching decision for him to make. I think he knew that this was really the only decision before them. And so in verse 11 to 14, he responds with two things: instructions on what to do and permission to take their brother. He can't even, I think this is so painful, mention his name. Take your brother. So he instructs them on the gift that they're to bring in verse 11, which is a costly gift fit for rulers, the choicest goods and quality fruits and delicacies from the land. Then in verse 12, he tells them about the money they're to bring, that they should not only bring money for the new food they're going to get, but for a return of the money that was in the mouth of their sacks. Remember last chapter, all that was right there that surprised them. And notice he says right here, he says, perhaps it was an oversight. I don't think Jacob is all in believing his son's tale. Maybe he thinks that they stole the food and they never gave the money in the first place. So perhaps it was an oversight. Perhaps there's more going on than meets the eye. He's entertaining that possibility, but then in the end, in verse 13, take your brother and go. But it's not the end of his words. In verse 14, he prays. And in this prayer, we see a troubled soul. May God Almighty grant you mercy before the man. And may he send back your other brother and Benjamin. And as for me, if I am bereaved of my children, I am bereaved. The Bible's full of lots of prayers from lots of people. Many of them are stout, robust, full of confidence and hope that we can just take onto our lips and soar within our own lives. This is not one of those prayers. This is a prayer of despairing resignation. Despairing resignation. Jacob has lost hope and has simply resigned himself to whatever is going to happen. You've all heard of the saying, hope for the best, plan for the worst. Jacob's only doing the back half of that statement. He is only planning that the worst possible outcome is the only thing that's going to come to pass here. That he is now going to be bereaved of the two sons of his favorite wife, Rachel. I do think Jacob's despairing here, but I also think that his prayer is not wholly dark. The only thing he can do, it's as if these are the only words he can muster to the Lord, is a plea for mercy. I would encourage you to not look down on Jacob here, but to seek to understand him. Have we also not been in a position where perhaps under severe trial and affliction, we have been near unable to pray? Or maybe we've not known what to pray, or maybe the only phrase we could get out of our mouths is, Lord, have mercy. I know many of you have known this and have been at the end of your rope, and that these really were the only words that you could muster. So yes, it's very dark for Jacob right now, but we see a ray of hope. We see light in the dark, that in the midst of this great and severe affliction, he reaches out to the only one who can right everything that is wrong about his situation. That is instructive for us, is it not? When the only thing you can say is, Lord, have mercy, because maybe you don't want to pray, you're unable to pray, or that's literally the only strength you have, do it. Because the Lord will hear and He will answer. And He is a God who delights to have mercy on His people. We see this prayer answered as the rest of the chapter unfolds. So we've seen them famished in Canaan in the first 14 verses. The rest of the chapter, we're going to see them now feasting in Egypt. I'm going to read the rest now, verse 15 to 34. So the men took this present, and they took double the money with them and Benjamin. They arose and went down to Egypt and stood before Joseph. All in one verse. All that trip. Like 7 words. When Joseph saw Benjamin with them, he said to the steward of his house, the position, remember, he used to have in Potiphar's house, the steward, bring the men into the house and slaughter an animal and make ready, for the men are to dine with me at noon. The man did as Joseph told him and brought the men to Joseph's house. And the men were afraid, because they were brought to Joseph's house, and they said, "It is because of the money which was replaced in our sacks the first time that we are brought in, so that he may assault us and fall upon us and make us servants and seize our donkeys." So they went up to the steward of Joseph's house and spoke with him at the door. They're not even in yet. And said, "Oh, my lord, we came down the first time to buy food, and when we came to the lodging place, we opened our sacks, and there was each man's money in the mouth of his sack, our money in full weight. So we have brought it again with us, and we've brought other money down with us to buy food. We do not know who put the money in our sacks." That probably took very quick, and probably a little bit out of breath. He replied, "Peace to you. Do not be afraid. Your God and the God of your father has put treasure in your sacks for you. I received your money." Then he brought Simeon out to them. And when the man had brought the men into Joseph's house and given them water, and they had washed their feet, and when he had given their donkeys fodder, they prepared the present for Joseph's coming at noon, for they heard that they should eat bread there. When Joseph came, they brought into the house to him the present that they had with him, and bowed down to him to the ground. And he inquired about their welfare, asking more questions, and said, "Is your father well, the old man of whom you spoke? Is he still alive?" They said, "Your servant, our father, is well. He is still alive." And they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves. And he lifted up his eyes, and he saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, and said, "Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? God be gracious to you, my son." Then Joseph hurried out, for his compassion grew warm for his brother, and he sought a place to weep. And he entered his chamber and wept there. Then he washed his face and came out, and controlling himself, he said, "Serve the food." They served him by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat with the Hebrews, for that is an abomination to the Egyptians. And they sat before him, it's Joseph, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth. And the men looked at one another in amazement. Portions were taken to them from Joseph's table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs, and they drank and were merry with him. As I told you as we were reading, verse 15 is quick. The brothers are taking. They're taking. They take the present, take the money, take Benjamin, leave for Egypt, and arrive before Joseph. All in one verse. A lot summarized because that's not where the meat and potatoes of the story is. In verse 16, Joseph sees them, notices they have brought Benjamin with them. He then instructs the steward that they are to be brought into his home so they can lunch together. The steward does this in verse 17, and then in verse 18, the drama picks back up as the pace slows down. The brothers were afraid as they entered into Joseph's house. They're being led to lunch, and they grow afraid. They then make this long explanation to the steward, not to Joseph, about the mistake that was made with the money. We bought food last time, and we paid for it. Remember, we paid for it. We weighed it all out, and we paid for it. And then we left, and we saw and opened our sacks, and there was our money. We had paid for it. Remember, we didn't steal this, but there's all our money. That they're afraid, not for the first time here in Egypt before Joseph. Remember last chapter they were afraid as soon as they start seeing that this man is testing them and severely pressing them with all kinds of questions. We saw in chapter 41 last week, the guilty conscience flares up. Oh my gosh, God is now outing us for what we did more than 20 years ago. Remember Joseph? His blood is on our hands, and clearly God is now giving us justice. So they freak out then. They have another similar freak out moment here over the money. All of this to show a guilty conscience will ruin almost any encounter and turn it towards suspicion rather than what's actually going on. That's what's happening in the brothers, is they're not even at lunch yet. They're on the way to it, not even with Joseph yet, but talking to his steward. And in verse 23, it's the steward who wonderfully sets them at ease. He hears their long explanation about the mistake with the money in the sacks, and he only responds with, "Peace to you. Do not be afraid." This is absolutely wonderful. They're in Egypt, remember, among Egyptian royalty, remember. Not the place you're going to hear Hebrew, not the place you're going to hear familiar language that you're used to, similar things you grew up with. And yet, as soon as they pour out all their fear to the steward, the very first word they hear is shalom. Shalom be to you. Do not be afraid. And then he says more. He says, I know all about the money. I received it. God, the word Elohim, not an Egyptian word for God, but the Hebrew name for God. He then tells them, after hearing shalom, they hear the name of God. God has put treasure in your sacks. Astonishing, fearful hearts receive peace and joy and providential understanding of how events had unfolded from an Egyptian. I wonder if they could already recognize that their father Jacob's prayer for mercy was being answered. But they probably didn't. They're in the midst of it, right? They're scurrying around, very fretful and fearful. They're probably not understanding and seeing things as they are because of the guilt in their conscience. Anywho, more good comes to them next as they're nearing the dining room. Simeon, their brother, who was jailed at their last trip, is now brought out to them. And then in their joy, all the brothers, all 11 are there reunited. They busy themselves by preparing the present for the man that they think the man that we know is Joseph. And so at noon, Joseph arrives. The brothers give him the gift, and in chapter 37 fashion, like the dreams said would happen, all 11 brothers bow down to Joseph, who immediately begins asking questions again, like he did in the last chapter, about how they're doing, about how their father is doing. And then in verse 29, it doesn't say he looks over. Notice it says he lifted his eyes. That in Genesis is a very peculiar, potent phrase. Anytime we see it, something really wonderful is going to follow. He lifted his eyes, and there is his own little brother. They have the same mom. They're the only two sons of Rachel. There's Benjamin. And so he asks in verse 29, is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me? They likely nod. And then Joseph responds, God be gracious to you, my son. This is a tender moment where Joseph expresses a rich and deep affection for his own brother. Ironically, this will be the exact phrase that is used later in the Aaronic famous blessing of Numbers chapter 6, specifically verse 25. The Lord make his face to shine on you and be gracious to you. It's the only two times in the Old Testament where that phrase, the first 5 books, the Torah, where this phrase is used, and it's on Joseph's lips first, before the great blessing to come. You wonder if this is the origin of the phrase. Well, Joseph, who's clearly feeling a lot right now, in verse 30, then turns and runs out of the room and finds a spot to weep. After 13 long years in the pit and in the palace, 7 abundant years of harvest, now likely a few years of famine, there has been so much time since he was murderously treated by his own brothers, yet at the sight of his own little brother, Joseph is undone and overwhelmed as his own history floods back to him. It's a swirl of joy and sorrow rising in him so much that he can't dam this flow of tears, so he gives it a clear course to flow. You can only wonder what the brothers are thinking at this moment. If the fear that they so presently feel is going to turn on them and everything that they're fearing is going to come true because this powerful man just ran out of the room when they saw Benjamin. He asked for him, he saw him, and just boop. And they're like, well, after composing himself, Joseph, the controlled man, comes back out and they eat together. And the scene comes to a conclusion. Joseph, to their amazement, arranges the order of their table places from oldest to youngest. And in this, perhaps even the brothers get a little glimpse. Something is going on more than we understand. Perhaps this man knows more about us than he has let on. But they have their favorite, or sorry, not their favorite, they have their separate eating situations that gives us a little bit of foreshadowing for the events of the Exodus to come in just a few chapters from here. We've been in Genesis for some time now. We're now winding down. The beginning of Exodus is right around the corner, where it will really be clear that abomination to the Egyptians is everything Hebrew. We see that here in their separate eating. But curiously, he gives Benjamin 5 times more food than anyone else. And if any of the other brothers, had the big boiler and they're hungry, they're like, he can't even eat all that. What's going on? What's Joseph doing? Is he testing them again? I think he is. Because the brothers responded really well last time when favoritism was shown. In his own perspective, when he was murderously treated, when Jacob showed such favoritism to him, but now gladly this doesn't faze them at all. The chapter ends in verse 34 with a happy scene, them all eating and drinking and enjoying one another's company, and a very agreeable turn of events. Mercy is indeed written large over this situation currently. Well, let's come back to where we began today. I began by saying all the major players before us in this chapter experience great trouble in the present because of their past. Yet in the end, they find relief and renewed joy. This was true for them in this chapter. It will be true for Jacob in a few chapters as he hears about the events that have taken place as they return back home with great news of glad tidings and great joy. But for those of you with a history that haunts you and it still troubles you, how can we have a similar end as verse 34 does? Here are 3 things I think we can learn from this chapter to that angle. First, learn that you're in good company. Jacob was so fearful of losing Benjamin, Rachel's other son, that he was blinded to the present predicament and needed to be prodded into obedience by Judah for everyone to be saved and so that no one would die. And even then, he simply just resigned himself to an evil fate that awaited him. The brothers were still plagued by what they did to Joseph long ago, so much so that when they feared about the money, their guilty conscience flared up once again, and they grew fearful in Egypt again. And Joseph is so moved at the presence of Benjamin, being overwhelmed with tears of joy and sorrow, that he had to flee the room to weep. If you have great trouble in your past, you can learn and be reminded here that you're in very good company. Many people think and are frustrated when they come to church, oh, those people are just a bunch of hypocrites. they're right, but they don't even know the half of it. Some of us don't even know the amount of courage it takes to walk in the doors of this room and sit down in a chair because of all the pain and the trouble in past years that are still slamming home in the present. If that's you, you're in good company. You belong with the people in this chapter. You belong in the church. You belong with us. That's the first thing we can learn. You're in good company. Second, we can learn that it's okay to feel troubled and weak. It's okay. We often have this view of the Christian life that's overly triumphant, where we think that in order to be faithful and thriving as Christians, we must ever be walking in a kind of victorious and strong posture. How are you? Blessed. And you're like, now, while we do have seasons of great strength, where the wells of encouragement seem to be never-ending and just bottomless as we open the Word and we just soar in praise immediately, that is not always our present condition. Weakness and fear will at times bring us low. And that's okay. We need to adjust our expectations of what the Christian life will really be like. And we need to look to the Lord whether we are in a pit or in a palace of sorts. So we're in good company. It's okay to be weak. That's 1 and 2. Lastly, we need to learn to see the cross. This is where the gospel comes into chapter 43 here. Judah's words to Jacob, way back in the first part of our chapter in verse 8 and 9, he sacrificially pledged, I will bear the blame forever if I do not bring Benjamin back home with me. In this, we see something of Christ, and we see and sense something of his cross for us. Judah desired to do this and to be this for the family, but really, was he able to do this? No. He was not able to be the one to bear the blame forever. But we know the one who is able to do this, who is strong enough to bear all our burdens and deal with them fully and finally on his cross. Church, the past might be painful, just like it was for everyone in our chapter here. But because of the cross, it no longer has to be paralyzing, because it's been dealt with. It's been handled, and because in the greatest display of mercy, Jesus tells each and every person who follows him that he will bear the blame forever for us if we come to him. So all these folks, even though they had great trouble here, the chapter ends in great joy and mirth and great relief. The same can be ours if we look to Christ. Whether we're soaring on the heights of praise, or whether we feel like we are at the bottom of the well looking up to see if there's any light left in our lives. You look to Jesus, and you can find great relief and renewed joy too. Pray with me.